Welcome to one of the most haunting stories to ever come out of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is. We'd love to know how far and wide these strange tales travel. Nestled in the shadow of those ancient ridges, once stood a weathered old inn known to locals as the Wynn Inn. Built in 1878, it sat on a steep hill overlooking Blacksburg, Virginia. To outsiders, it looked like just another cozy place to spend the night. But townsfolk knew better. They warned friends to stay clear, whispering that the place carried a chill that didn't come from mountain air. The inn was a grand 3-story Victorian with pointed gables and a wraparound porch. But something about it always felt wrong, not because of one specific event, but because of the constant sense that something unseen was moving behind its lace curtains. In 1904, what began as a simple maintenance check exposed a horrifying truth that changed everything people thought they knew about that building. Behind its elegant wallpaper and beneath its thick carpets, authorities uncovered things that raised disturbing questions about every single guest who had ever stayed there over the past 26 years. County records show the case was quietly closed in 1968, sealed under federal order, and then supposedly lost in a mysterious office fire that same year. Yet fragments of the story survived, letters, old journals, and rumors from those who had sworn to stay silent. This is the story of the Wynn Inn and the terrible secrets hidden within its walls. The building had 22 rooms, each decorated with carefully chosen antiques that, as later investigations showed, weren't placed by chance. The inn stood at a crossroads between the old Richmond stagecoach line and the newer rail route, heading west to the coal towns, bringing a steady flow of travelers, businessmen, government agents, and families chasing opportunity. The owner, Thaddeus Wynn, had inherited the place from his father. He was a tidy man with sharp eyes and a habit of showing up silently where guests least expected him, at the end of a dark hallway in the dining room, shadows, or standing perfectly still in the garden long after midnight. Outwardly, the Wynn Inn was a respectable stop for travelers. Its rooms were clean, the food plain but decent, and its prices fair. But what set it apart was Thaddeus's obsession with record-keeping. Every guest was logged in elegant handwriting, their names, occupations, destinations, even their sleeping and eating habits. Some notes included overheard conversations and personal details no ordinary innkeeper should have known. These ledgers would later become the key to understanding what had truly gone on inside. On April 17, 1904, a plumber named James Harrington was called to fix a recurring issue with the water pressure on the 3rd floor. Guests had complained that the water sometimes stopped altogether, only to surge back minutes later. Harrington, who'd serviced the place before, suspected a blockage between rooms 17 and 18. But when he crawled into the narrow space between those walls, he stumbled upon something far more disturbing. Years later, his grandson told a local historian that Harrington was never the same after that day haunted until his death in 1931. In his official statement to the Montgomery County Sheriff, Harrington described how the wallpaper in one section had peeled away, revealing strange writing on the plaster lists of dates, initials, and symbols scratched in by several different hands. Some neat, others frenzied. Then, he noticed something else. A small metal box plastered over and hidden behind the wall. Water damage had exposed it. The box was locked, but modern, not something from the inn's original construction. When Sheriff Thomas Blackwood arrived and pried it open, he found a folded diagram of the Wynn Inn with room 17 marked in red ink. Notes in the margins mentioned observation points, auditory channels, and influence markers. The sheriff didn't understand what those words meant at the time. But as his investigation went on, their meaning would grow darker and far more terrifying. The discovery beneath the floorboards required the temporary relocation of the room's occupant, a traveling pharmaceutical salesman named George Porter. He wasn't pleased about being moved, but after some persuasion, he agreed to spend the night in another room. reporter would later become a key witness in the investigation. Though his interviews, like much of the case, were sealed by federal order, wrapped in oilcloth beneath the marked boards, investigators found a leather-bound journal belonging to Eleanor Wynn, Thaddeus Wynn's wife, who had supposedly died of tuberculosis 3 years earlier in 1901. Her death had never raised suspicion. Consumption was common in the region, and Eleanor had been ill for years. No doctor had attended her passing, and her burial in the small family plot behind the inn was carried out quickly, with only Thaddeus and a few staff members present. The journal's contents were never made public, but according to Deputy Walter Collins, whose letters were later preserved by the Virginia Historical Society, what they read that day horrified everyone in the room. Collins wrote to his brother, "I have never seen the sheriff so disturbed by anything in all my years of service." Sheriff Blackwood immediately shut down the inn and ordered all guests relocated, citing only public safety as his reason. The search that followed lasted 17 days. During that time, Thaddeus Wynn vanished. He'd supposedly left for Richmond the day before the plumber's discovery, but telegraphs confirmed he never arrived. Some believed he had been warned, perhaps by someone inside the investigation itself. The inn employed 8 staff members, a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, a stable hand, a handyman, a clerk, and a porter. All were questioned extensively. Most denied knowing anything unusual, though. Several described strange routines and unexplained rules. The cook, Margaret Wilson, said Wynn often gave specific meal instructions for guests in certain rooms, sometimes requesting odd ingredients or special preparations that seemed to follow a hidden pattern. One maid, Sarah Jenkins, confessed that she was forbidden to clean room 17 unless directly ordered by Thaddeus, and even then, only while he supervised. The handyman, Robert Taylor, admitted to making unusual modifications to several rooms over the years, but claimed he had simply followed instructions without asking questions. As investigators searched the inn, they uncovered a network of hidden features. In room 8, removable floorboards, concealed crude listening devices, early acoustic instruments connected to hollow tubes running through the walls. Room 14's wardrobe opened into a narrow observation space with small holes drilled through the carvings for someone to watch the room unseen. Room 22 held an elaborate system of speaking tubes disguised behind paintings, furniture, and paneling, allowing someone in the office downstairs to hear conversations from multiple rooms. The precision and expense of these modifications suggested professional engineering far beyond what a country innkeeper should have been capable of. But room 17 held the most disturbing secrets. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe, a washstand by the window. Yet nothing about the room was random. The floorboards were spaced to create a subtle unevenness that forced guests into a state of mild physical tension. The writing desk's angle caused discomfort over time, the kind that might wear down focus or sanity. Even the glass in the window had been deliberately warped to distort the light-shifting colors and brightness in ways that subtly affected mood. Behind the headboard, they found a hidden compartment. Inside were personal belongings, lockets, cufflinks, and pieces of jewelry. Each item traced to different missing persons, at least 7 in total. Among the personal belongings hidden behind the headboard were pocket watches, wedding rings, letters, and identification papers. None of the names matched any official missing person records. Yet the inn's own ledgers showed that each of these individuals had stayed in room 17 between 1892 and 1903. Their entries contained strange phrases like subject responsive to auditory stimuli during delta phase, subject exhibits heightened suggestibility following method C application, and subject integration nearly complete, ready for final phase. No one could explain what these notes meant, but investigators quickly realized they were not random scribbles. The most unsettling find came from Thaddeus Wynn's private office, where a locked chest held several leather-bound books. Inside were meticulous, almost clinical reports about the inn's guests, details that went far beyond what could be learned during a short visit. The entries included personal histories, childhood memories, fears, and ambitions. Information no ordinary innkeeper could possibly know. Even more disturbing, many records were written before the guests had even arrived, implying that Wynn had access to an extensive system of surveillance or information sharing long before they ever crossed his threshold. Letters uncovered during the investigation revealed that Wynn had maintained contact with other innkeepers and hoteliers across the East Coast. These correspondences spoke cryptically of shared observations and a mutual endeavor, suggesting a coordinated network collecting data on travelers. What they were collecting it for remained unclear. No bodies were discovered on the premises, and no confirmed disappearances could be tied to the inn. Yet the evidence suggested a deeply organized system of psychological observation, perhaps even experimentation, that had operated undetected for decades. The investigation took a darker turn when deputies discovered a concealed basement chamber behind the old coal chute. Inside was a small office, with a desk, a single chair, and walls lined with filing cabinets. Each cabinet drawer contained folders labeled with the names of guests and the dates of their stays. Inside the folders were handwritten reports and small physical samples. Strands of hair, fingernail clippings, fragments of clothing, all carefully preserved. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, a physician from Roanoke assisting the investigation, described in his private notes what he called an unprecedented level of psychological intrusion. His writings detail methods of environmental control designed to manipulate guests' moods and behaviors. He noted the strategic placement of objects, the alteration of light, and the control of acoustics all appear to have been arranged to provoke specific emotional responses. Among Wynn's papers were several notebooks that read like experimental manuals. They described how to induce sleep disruption, confusion, and emotional vulnerability using subtle physical cues. The tone of these writings was disturbingly detached, methodical, and scientific. "These are not the ramblings of a lunatic," Whitaker wrote. "They are the records of deliberate human experimentation conducted under the guise of hospitality." On May 11, 1904, federal agents arrived in Blacksburg without warning. They seized all documents, specimens, and artifacts from the Wynn Inn, declaring the investigation classified as a matter of national security. No reason was ever provided. Local authorities were ordered to cease all inquiries, and everyone involved was required to sign binding confidentiality agreements. The inn was condemned, boarded up, and officially declared unsafe for occupation. 6 months later, it burned to the ground. The fire department was told not to intervene. The official report blamed faulty electrical wiring, though the building had never been wired for electricity, a contradiction quietly ignored in government records. For decades, the Wynn Inn faded into obscurity, surviving only in whispers among old-timers who swore the land itself had gone bad. Locals refused to build on the site, and travelers who asked for lodging near the crossroads were always sent farther away without explanation. In 1938, a University of Virginia graduate student named Margaret Holbrook stumbled upon the story while researching early inns of the Blue Ridge. Her curiosity was met with silence and suspicion. "No one wants to discuss the old Wynn place," she wrote in her field notes. "When I bring it up, people turn pale or walk away." One elderly woman crossed herself and refused to speak further. A local shopkeeper who had mentioned the inn by name moments earlier suddenly claimed he'd never heard of it. Undeterred, Holbrook filed information requests with several government offices. But what she uncovered next would deepen the mystery even more. Most of Margaret Holbrook's requests for information were denied. But in 1941, she finally received a partial response from the Department of the Interior. Inside was a set of heavily redacted documents, confirming that the federal government had indeed taken part in the Wynn Inn investigation, and nearly 40 years later was still working to keep its details secret. Among those papers was a memo dated June 3, 1904, written by an unnamed federal agent. The only unredacted portion read, "The methods employed at the Wynn establishment represent an advancement in behavioral study that, while morally reprehensible, may have applications for our ongoing work. Recommend full containment of all information and acquisition of relevant materials for further analysis." No agency name appeared on the document, and the rest was blacked out, leaving behind only a chilling suggestion that someone had seen value in Thaddeus Wynn's methods. Holbrook's research was cut short by World War II, and she never returned to the project. Her notes and documents sat untouched in the University of Virginia archives until 1967. When Professor James Thornton, a criminologist researching the psychology of criminal behavior, stumbled across them while preparing a book on unsolved cases in Virginia. Intrigued by the implications, Thornton tracked down Walter Collins, the last surviving deputy from the 1904 investigation. By then, Collins was an old man in a nursing home in Lynchburg. At first, he refused to talk. "Some things are best left buried," he told Thornton. "Not because they're dead, but because they're still alive in ways you wouldn't understand." The Wynn business didn't end when the inn burned down, it just went deeper underground. Eventually, Thornton earned his trust, and the old deputy began to talk. According to Thornton's notes, Collins confirmed that Wynn's activities were not random acts of cruelty or madness, but part of a deliberate series of psychological experiments. "Every room was a study," Collins said. The furniture, the colors, the sounds, even the way the floorboards creaked. Everything was meant to provoke something different in whoever stayed there. He explained that Wynn would subtly alter rooms between guests, changing a lamp's position, adjusting the wallpaper pattern, or replacing the bedding, and then record how each visitor behaved. Some rooms were designed to induce sadness, others to spark anger or fear. Room 17, Collins said, was for the culmination, though he never learned what that meant. Guests who stayed there often reported vivid nightmares or sudden personality changes. A mild-mannered merchant who spent 3 nights in room 9 became uncontrollably angry for weeks afterward. A woman who stayed 1 night in room 14 developed severe anxiety that lingered for months. Even more disturbing, some guests continued to experience these effects long after they'd left. Collins said Eleanor Wynn's journal revealed how her husband's obsession evolved from curiosity to something far darker. She wrote that he would stay awake through the night, listening to the guests' private moments through the inn's network of speaking tubes, grieving, laughing, whispering in their sleep. He was particularly fascinated by dreams and claimed to have developed ways to influence them, using subtle sounds, lighting, and even scents. At first, Eleanor had helped him, but her tone shifted over time, her entries growing fearful. In one passage, she confessed that she suspected she had become one of her husband's test subjects. "I find my thoughts turning in directions that do not feel like my own," she wrote. "I wonder if the tea he insists on preparing for me each night contains more than the herbal remedy he claims." According to Collins, the most frightening revelation wasn't about the inn itself. It was about what Wynn was part of. The letters found in his office hinted at a network far larger than anyone imagined. These weren't just innkeepers, Collins told Thornton. There were doctors, lawyers, government men. They called themselves the Observatory. They believed they were building a science of human control. This group allegedly shared research methods and even subjects, directing certain travelers to specific establishments to continue their observations. Their correspondence described a progressive system beginning with mild environmental influence and escalating to direct psychological intervention. What they ultimately intended to achieve was never discovered. Thornton's research ended as suddenly as the others before him. In January 1968, while driving to meet another witness near the old Wynn property, his car veered off the road and crashed. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was listed as a heart attack. His notes, recordings, and the original Wynn Inn documents were never found. No autopsy was ever performed on Professor Thornton, despite repeated requests from his colleagues who pointed out that he had been in excellent health and had passed a routine physical just 2 months earlier. Later that same year, a mysterious fire broke out at the Montgomery County Records Office, conveniently destroying the last remaining files related to the Wynn Inn case. Around the same time, the University of Virginia archives, where Margaret Holbrook's collection was stored, was broken into, and the only materials taken were hers. A week after his final meeting with Thornton, Deputy Walter Collins passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving no written testimony behind. For a while, it seemed the entire story had finally been buried, both literally and figuratively. But in 1965, highway construction crews working through the Blue Ridge Mountains unearthed something that reignited the legend. Roughly 20 miles from the old Wynn Inn site, workers uncovered a sealed cave while excavating a hillside. Inside was a leather trunk containing books, papers, and personal items belonging to Thaddeus Wynn himself. The find appeared to confirm that Wynn had survived long enough to hide his work before disappearing for good. Among the items was a journal that described in chillingly clinical language what he called the grand experiment. According to accounts from workers who briefly saw the contents before federal agents seized them, the journal revealed that the inn had been designed from the start as a living laboratory. A structure built to test how controlled environments could shape human behavior. Each room represented a different experiment, carefully arranged to provoke specific emotions or mental states. Architectural sketches showed how the building had been continuously modified as Wynn refined his methods. The notes described something called graduated exposure, a process where subjects, returning guests in particular, were subjected to increasingly intense psychological conditions over multiple visits. Room 17 was reserved for those who had reached the final phase. Wynn's writing spoke of his goal to achieve what he termed complete environmental control, the ability to shape every sensory and emotional experience a person had without their awareness. His diagrams showed intricate systems of ventilation, light manipulation, and sound design, along with hints of chemical treatments embedded in materials like wallpaper and bedding. The purpose of these modifications remains unclear, but the personal belongings found hidden behind the headboard of room 17 suggest that some guests never truly left the inn, or at least never left as themselves. In one passage, Wynn wrote about terminal subjects who have completed the protocol, though whether that referred to death, mental collapse, or something even stranger has never been determined. Federal agents arrived at the construction site within hours of the discovery. They confiscated all materials, sealed the cave, and rerouted the highway to bury the location permanently. Workers were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, though whispers of what they saw lingered for years. One worker later told a local paper that the men who took the materials weren't from the FBI or any police department I've ever seen. They didn't say who they were, they just showed credentials that made everyone step aside. Rumors spread that the recovered items included a map showing other inns and hotels across the country, linked to the so-called observatory network. If that map existed, it was never released. Many came to believe that the Wynn Inn was just one part of a coordinated effort, a system of establishments quietly experimenting on unwitting travelers under the guise of hospitality. The implications were unsettling, especially in light of how aggressively the government continued to suppress the case. Some suggested Wynn's work had been absorbed into classified research on behavioral influence. Others feared it had simply continued under a different name. In 1969, a former guest named Harold Simmons came forward with a vivid recollection of his stay at the inn in 1902. A traveling salesman at the time, Simmons remembered spending 3 nights in room 12. "I've never slept so poorly in my life," he told local historian Evelyn Porter in a recorded interview. "Each night, I had the same kind of nightmare, being watched, being studied. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like someone else was writing it as I lived it." He recalled how the room subtly changed each day. The wardrobe moved slightly, the shade was drawn to a different height. "At first I thought the maid was just careless," he said. "But when I mentioned it to Mr. Wynn, he told me no one was allowed to touch a guest's room once it was prepared. The way he said it, it was rehearsed like he'd been waiting for me to ask." Simmons also described hearing rhythmic tapping in the walls every night between midnight and precisely 2:17 a.m. "It was too regular to be the house settling," he said. "It was human. Someone was doing it on purpose." On his final night, he awoke to find Wynn himself sitting silently in the corner of the room. He said he'd gotten the wrong room while checking on another guest, but he wasn't embarrassed. He looked satisfied, like he'd seen what he came for. Another account surfaced in 1966 when a letter was found among the family papers of Emily Patterson, a former maid who had worked at the inn briefly in 1899. She described Wynn as meticulous and deeply unsettling. "He asked about my dreams, my sleep habits, and whether I could keep secrets," she wrote. "When I said I rarely dream, he looked disappointed, as though I had failed some test I didn't know I was taking." Patterson recalled how every detail of room preparation had to follow Wynn's specific instructions: the exact angle of a mirror, the height of a lamp, the fold of a sheet. When I suggested a quicker way, he said any deviation would contaminate the environment. "That's not something an innkeeper says, it's something a scientist says." She was later ordered to clean room 17 under Wynn's supervision. He stood in the doorway the whole time, watching every move she wrote. The room looked normal, but it felt wrong. Heavy. "I noticed small holes drilled beneath the writing desk, too precise to be natural. When I leaned closer, he sharply told me to move on." Patterson resigned the next morning, citing a family emergency she admitted was fabricated. "There is something wrong in that place," her letter concluded. "He watches everyone, the guests, the staff. I think we are all part of his experiment." The most recent piece of the puzzle came in 1968, when the Virginia Historical Society received an anonymous donation, a collection of letters allegedly written by members of the observatory between 1890 and 1903. If authentic, they suggest the Wynn Inn was only the beginning, and that Wynn's experiment was part of something far larger and far from finished. The authenticity of the letters donated to the Virginia Historical Society has never been proven, yet their contents are deeply unsettling. They describe coordinated psychological experiments conducted at various inns, hotels, and boarding houses across the eastern United States, with the Wynn Inn repeatedly cited as a model of excellence. The timing of the donation arriving just months after Professor Thornton's death has led some to believe the sender may have been connected to the original investigation, someone determined to preserve the truth before it vanished completely. The letters outline a disturbing philosophy that moral restraint was the greatest obstacle to scientific progress. To truly understand the human mind, one letter declares we must observe it in moments of greatest duress, when consciousness itself is tested. The author argued that informed consent corrupted results because awareness of being studied altered behavior. Only those unaware they were subjects could provide pure data. The correspondence describes a network of seemingly ordinary establishments, chosen for their isolation and constant flow of travelers, places where guests could vanish unnoticed. These locations were secretly fitted with observation chambers, hidden passageways, and mechanisms to alter temperature, light, and sound. Among them, the Wynn Inn was hailed as the most advanced of our facilities, capable of environmental manipulations so subtle that even sensitive subjects remained unaware they were being controlled. Several letters refer to an event planned for the autumn of 1904, something called the culmination, the final synthesis of our collective work. This was to be the demonstration that proved the observatory's theories and secured its legacy. But the discovery of the hidden journals that spring and the sudden intervention of authorities appear to have interrupted whatever had been planned. A letter dated March 1904 mentions the arrival of the delegation and the need for subjects at various stages of the protocol. Most chilling are the references to what the writers called permanent acquisitions. Individuals who responded unusually well to the methods and were retained for continued observation. These subjects, it seems, were quietly transferred from one facility to another. Their disappearances explained through forged letters, fake job offers, or invented family emergencies. Whether these acquisitions were physically confined or psychologically controlled is unclear, but the implication is unmistakable. They were not free. Today, the site where the Wynn Inn once stood is nothing more than a grassy field bordered by trees. The road that once led to its doors has been rerouted. A gas station now marks the old crossroads. There are no plaques, no foundations, no visible trace of the building that once stood there. Most locals don't even know the name. Yet something of its influence endures. Across the decades, the ideas Thaddeus Wynn explored the manipulation of emotion through environmental design. The shaping of thought through sensory control have quietly resurfaced in modern behavioral science. Concepts like environmental priming, unconscious behavioral modification, and my context-dependent emotional response now appear in academic journals introduced as innovations of mid-20th century psychology. But those who have compared the fragments of Wynn's writings to these later theories see unmistakable parallels. The timeline is equally troubling. The reemergence of these concepts coincides with government-funded research into psychological manipulation during the Cold War programs that were later partially declassified and admitted to have used human subjects without consent. Whether these efforts drew directly from Wynn's work cannot be proven, but the similarities are difficult to dismiss. So the questions remain. How many other establishments were part of the observatory's network? How deeply did their methods infiltrate modern science, and how many unsuspecting travelers, stepping into rooms that seemed harmless, became unwilling participants in experiments designed to probe the limits of the human mind? Perhaps most unsettling of all is the thought that the work of the Wynn Inn never truly ended, that the techniques born in its shadowed halls may have survived refined and disguised operating now, in places we'd never think to question. The full truth will likely never be known. Too many records were erased, too many witnesses silenced, too many files marked as lost, burned, or stolen. What endures are only fragments, letters, diaries, official memos, blacked out with ink that, when assembled, form the outline of something deeply calculated. Behind its polished Victorian charm, the Wynn Inn was not a home for weary travelers, but a laboratory for human behavior, where Thaddeus Wynn studied the mind as if it were a machine probing, breaking, and reassembling it without consent or compassion. The harm he caused cannot be fully measured. Yet what evidence remains suggests that many of his guests left forever, altered, haunted, hollow, or subtly rewired in ways they could not name. One of the earliest known victims, William Garrett, a successful lumber merchant, spent only 3 nights at the inn in October 1899. His wife's letters describe his return home as the arrival of a stranger. "A shadow has fallen across his mind," she wrote. "He startles at nothing, stares at corners as if someone stands there unseen." Within months, Garrett abandoned his work and withdrew from everyone he loved. By 1902, he had been committed to Western State Hospital, where he lived out his remaining years, murmuring that he was still in the room. Doctors dismissed his condition as paranoia, unaware of how close they were to the truth. Decades later, Professor James Thornton found others who had stayed at the inn, people who suffered similar symptoms, recurring nightmares, persistent feelings of being watched, and disorienting dreams of a place they could never quite remember, but somehow knew. The inn had vanished, but its presence had not. What truly haunts the case, however, is not what we know, but what was hidden. The sealed rooms, the missing ledgers, the secretive observatory network, and the quiet federal hand that moved to bury the truth all suggest the same conclusion: someone saw value in Wynn's work. When the inn burned in 1904, the research didn't die with it. It was inherited, studied, and refined. Those who tried to follow the story found themselves obstructed at every turn. Files vanished days before scheduled viewings. Photographs disappeared from archives. Sources fell silent. In 1959, journalist Marion Hayes described her failed investigation. It's as if the story itself resists being told. Every lead evaporates, every witness forgets. I've never felt so clearly that something or someone was one step ahead of me. Professor Thornton came to the same realization before his mysterious death in 1968. In his final notes, he wrote, "The Wynn Inn was not an isolated event. It was the surface of something larger. The locations change, the tools evolve, but the principle remains: manipulation without consent, observation masked as normality." His words gained new meaning years later when declassified government documents surfaced. A heavily redacted report from 1976 described the acquisition of behavioral modification techniques from a private research initiative circa 1904, praised for their environmental rather than chemical approach and their ability to operate in non-controlled settings with minimal detection risk. The report did not name the Wynn Inn, but the timeline and methods were unmistakable. If true, it suggests that Wynn's legacy extended far beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. Over the decades that followed, new fields, environmental psychology, architectural behavior studies, emerged exploring how light, space, and sound shape human thought. Yet certain techniques mirrored Wynn's original concepts too closely to ignore. Architectural historians began noting recurring design elements in public institutions, subtle asymmetries, unnatural lighting, gentle inclines that subtly affect posture and mood. The brilliance of Wynn's design, wrote Dr. Elizabeth Mercer in 1966, was its invisibility. Ordinary rooms with extraordinary intent. Today, the site of the Wynn Inn is an unremarkable field bordered by oaks, the highway droning nearby. Yet locals still whisper about flickering lights on April nights, as though the past occasionally stirs. One hiker claimed he wandered into the clearing and, standing in the overgrown foundation, felt watched from all sides. "It hit me," he said. "I was standing in room 17. In what's believed to be his final entry, Thaddeus Wynn wrote, "The true power of our work lies not in the manipulations themselves, but in their permanence. The subject carries the environment within them long after departure. The room extends beyond its walls, living on through those who have known it." If Wynn was right, then perhaps the inn's influence never ended. It persists in minds and institutions, in the quiet spaces where environment and thought intertwine. We tell ourselves the inn is gone, its fire reduced to ash and rumor. But what if what burned was only the building, not the idea? What if the rooms still exist in the offices we work in, the stations we pass through, the rooms where we sleep? Maybe that's the true horror of the Wynn Inn, not the madness that once filled its halls, but the possibility that we are still living inside its experiment, unaware that the walls around us are still watching.